What's going on, guys? My name is Matt and I am back with a new PC build. This time the price point is $500, and for that price you're getting some pretty good performance taking into account the current market. This is going to be a full build guide, meaning I'm not only going to be showing you each of the parts and why I picked them, but I'm also going to be showing you how to put it together step by step. Now this PC is using all new parts with the exception of the graphics card, which isn't ideal, but I'll get into why later in the video. For $500 you're getting a set of hardware that is reliable, high quality, and should last you for years to come. This is going to be able to play most any game you throw at it. It's perfect for stuff like Valorant and Fortnite, but you may need to turn the settings down a bit on newer AAA titles. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the parts that make up this $500 gaming beast. The first thing I usually like to talk about is the CPU, because other than the graphics card, this has the biggest impact on gaming performance. Right now, if you're wanting to build a new budget gaming PC and need a CPU around $100, the only good option is the i3-10100F. This is a 4-core 8-thread CPU running on the Comet Lake architecture that comes in at right around $90. It has a base and boost clock of 3.6 and 4.3 GHz respectively. 4 cores and 8 threads is perfect for a budget gaming PC and should be enough for streaming lighter titles and basic video editing. The F in the name means there's no integrated graphics, but that's fine because we are using a dedicated graphics card. One other nice thing about this CPU is the fact it comes with a free cooler in the box. It's the very basic Intel stock cooler, but as you'll see in the benchmark section of this video, this cooler does a good job of keeping this i3 nice and cool. It's basically just a hunk of aluminum with a fan attached, and it doesn't look amazing, but because it was free in the box, it means we can save money in this area to be used in another. The motherboard this CPU and cooler are mounting to is the Gigabyte B460M DS3H Revision 2. This is a micro ATX board that I picked up for right around $85. For this price, it offers a pretty good value. It has 4 DIMM slots, an M.2 slot, good PCIe expansion, and a nice neutral color scheme. My one complaint is the fact there is only 5 back panel USB ports, which may be a deal breaker to some. One other thing to mention is the newer B560 version of this board oftentimes can be purchased for the same price or cheaper, so I'll leave both options linked in the description. Getting the B560 version will not affect the build guide at all and will give you a newer board with an extra back panel USB port. Moving on to the RAM, this isn't a super important area as locked Intel CPUs like this 10100F only support up to 2666 MHz RAM. With that in mind, I decided to look for the cheapest 16GB kit I could find that was still of decent quality. What I ended up getting was this 2x8GB kit of silicon powered DDR4 RAM rated to run at 3000 MHz CL16. Again, this isn't anything fancy, but at right around $50, the value it offers is great. 16GB is enough for modern gaming and is even enough for streaming and light video editing. One other nice thing is the fact this kit will only take up 2 of the 4 DIMM slots, meaning upgrading in the future will be as easy as popping in 2 more 8GB sticks. Next, let's talk about the SSD. After putting some thought into it, I decided to go with the tried and trusted Western Digital Blue SM550. This is a budget NVMe drive, but at only $43 for the 500GB model, it's an insane value in my opinion. Read and write speeds are good, especially compared to any SATA drive, and I've used this particular one in a ton of builds and have never had a problem with it. 500GB is plenty for your OS, applications, and a modest games library. Because this drive is in the ultra compact M.2 form factor, it means installation is super simple and takes less than a minute to install. If 500GB isn't enough, you can always upgrade storage in the future, which is one of the easier upgrades to do, or you could go for the 1TB model of this drive for more storage out of the gate. The next thing to talk about is, of course, the graphics card. If we were in an alternate universe where you could buy GPUs at MSRP, then a GTX 1650 Super or RX 5500 XT would both be great options for this build at around $150, but unfortunately we have to deal with the current market. With a budget of $150, shopping on eBay, the best card we can get are a GTX 960 or R9 280. If you have an extra $50, going up to the GTX 970 would be a very good idea, but to keep within the budget, I decided to go for a GTX 960. This is an older card at this point, but it still performs really well and will work great as a placeholder while you wait for a better deal on a modern graphics card. Any esports games like Fortnite and Valorant this will play with ease, but newer AAA titles you will have to turn the graphics down to play them at 1080p with 60 plus FPS. One downside of this card is the 2GB of video memory, but in my testing that wasn't a huge problem. Also, the GTX 970 has 4GB of video memory, so that's another reason why you may want to step up to that for $50 more. With all this being said, the GTX 960 overall worked very well in this build, and while it's not ideal, it does get the job done. To power the system, I went for a basic but reliable unit. What I got was the EVGA 500BR. As the name implies, this is a 500 watt 80 plus bronze rated unit that is usually able to be purchased for under $40. It's nothing fancy and is non-modular, but it does have all black sleeve cables to keep the build looking clean. 500 watts is more than enough for this build, and overall this unit worked out great in this system. Finally, let's talk about the case. After doing a bunch of searching, I landed on getting the Cougar Gemini M. For the only $45 this case normally goes for, this is a really good value in my opinion. It's a micro ATX enclosure with a tinted tempered glass panel, power supply basement, and subjectively really nice looks. The RGB on this case is pretty awesome and is an implementation I don't think I've seen anywhere else before. Airflow on this guy isn't amazing, but even with only a single exhaust fan, temps were still more than acceptable, which you'll be able to see in the benchmark section of the video. The brush metal effect looks nice, there are plenty of dust filters, and overall I think this is a really good budget case. So now that you have an understanding of each of the parts and why I picked them, it's now time to show you how to put this system together step by step. To build this PC, you'll need a normal size Phillips head screwdriver, a smaller one for the M.2 screw, and possibly a pair of pliers. Make sure you have an open area to work in and have blocked off an hour or so to put this guy together. With your parts in hand, your tools ready to go, and your workspace cleared, it means it's now time to start assembling your new PC. You can start by getting out your motherboard box. Open it up and grab the board itself along with the I/O shield and the small M.2 screw. Now place the board on top of the box and get out your CPU box. You can pull out the CPU plastic shell and open it up, but don't pull the CPU out just yet. Go back to your motherboard and bring your attention to the center of the board. Press down and out on the metal retention arm, then lift it up, flipping over the socket cover. Grab your CPU, handling it only by the edges, and line the little triangle on the CPU with the marked corner on the motherboard, or another way to orient it is to make sure the Intel Core text at the top of the IHS is closest to the top of the socket where the socket hinges. Once lined up, lower it down, applying no pressure, it should just slip in. Once it's in, you can lower the socket cover down, then return the metal retention arm to its starting position like this. The plastic socket cover will pop off. This is fine, and make sure to keep this in case you need to RMA or sell your motherboard in the future. Now grab your CPU cooler and orient it with the Intel logo facing up, then you can lower it down, matching up the pegs on the cooler with the holes in the board. Once lowered down, you can press the clips in one at a time, going in a cross pattern. Now grab the CPU fan cable and locate the CPU fan header to the top right of the cooler. Line the notch in the cable connector with the notch in the header and press it into place. Next, this is optional and you can do it however you want, but I just took the excess cable length and tried to clean it up by routing it and tucking it away as much as I could. With that complete, your CPU and cooler are successfully installed and we can move on to the RAM. We're going to be installing our sticks into slots 2 and 4, which are the gray ones. Start by opening the clips on both ends of each slot. Take your first stick of RAM and orient it so the notch in the stick lines up with the notch in the slot. Once lined up, lower it down and press in both ends until you hear a clicking noise and see the clip snap shut. Now just take your second stick of RAM and install it into slot 4 the same way you did it for the other stick. With that done, your RAM is successfully installed and we can move on to installing our SSD. Get out your SSD and bring your attention to the M.2 slot beneath the cooler. Take your SSD and line the notch in it with the notch in the slot and insert it at an angle like this. Now you can hinge it down and secure it with the M.2 screw that we pulled out of the motherboard box earlier. With that done, you can put your motherboard to the side and grab out your case box. Pulling the box away from the case instead of trying to pull the case out of the box is much easier and highly recommended. With the case out, you can lie it on its side and remove the 4 thumb screws securing the glass panel. You can now lift the panel away like this and move it to the side. Next, with the case on its feet, you can remove the 2 back panel screws, and be careful because mine just started to fall after removing the second thumb screw. Next, pull out this hard drive sled that holds a box containing all the screws necessary to build this PC. You can also now undo this bundle of wires. You can now set the case on its side and grab out 3 standoffs that look like this. Now with either your fingers, a pair of pliers, or a nut driver like me, install these standoffs into the holes here, and here. With those in, grab the I/O shield we removed from the box earlier, take it and orient it like this, then lower it down to the I/O cutout. Once lined up, press each corner in, one at a time, until the I/O shield is in place and secure. With that done, you can take your motherboard, handling it by its cooler, and lower it in like this, lining the I/O on the board with the I/O shield, and making sure you can see the standoffs beneath the motherboard holes. Now take 8 motherboard screws that look like this and install one in each of the holes with a standoff beneath it. Order doesn't matter, just make sure they're all secure. With that done, you can flip the case back onto its feet and get out your power supply. Take it with the fan facing down and push it into the case like this. Line up the holes in the power supply with the holes in the case, then use 4 screws that came with the power supply or 4 from the case screw bag and install one into each of the 4 holes. It's now time to start routing cables. Start by taking the 8-pin CPU cable that looks like this and push it through this hole here. Next, take your 24-pin cable that looks like this and push it through this hole here. Now take your PCIe power cable that looks like this and fish it through this hole here. You can now take the blue USB 3 cable and push it through the same hole you put the 24-pin through here. Now take the little front panel connectors that look like this and push them through this hole right here. Now take the USB 2 cable that looks like this and push it through the same hole we pushed the PCIe power cable through. And finally take the HD audio cable that looks like this and push it through this hole here. We can now flip the case onto its side to start plugging things in. Start by bringing your attention to the top left of the motherboard and by grabbing the fan cable from the back case fan. Take this cable and plug it into the fan header at the top left. This plugs in exactly like the CPU fan just by lining up the notches and pressing it into place. With that in, we can take our CPU power cable and plug it into the CPU power header next to the fan header by lining up the clip on the connector with the bump out on the header, then pressing it into place. With that done, we can move to the right side of the motherboard where we'll plug in the 24-pin and USB 3. Start by taking the 24-pin, making sure it's pressed together, line up the clip on the connector with the bump out on the header and press it into place. For USB 3, just take the connector and line the bump out on it with the cutout on the header and press it into place. We can now move our attention to the bottom of the board, starting at the left side. Take the HD audio cable and bring it to the HD audio header on the motherboard. With the HD audio text facing down, line it up and press it into place. Next, take the USB 2 cable and plug it into one of the 2 open headers with the USB text facing up. Now we can plug in those pesky front panel connectors. Start with the power LED ones and plug them into the top left 2 pins with the positive to the left. Now take the power button cable and plug it in directly to the right of that. Orientation doesn't matter. With all those cables plugged in, we're now ready to start the process of installing the graphics card. At the back of the case, loosen the screw, lift up this cover, then tighten it back down. Now remove the top 2 PCIe covers by bending them back and forth until they snap off and you can lift them away. Now you can open the PCIe lock on the top slot like this and grab your graphics card. Line the notch in the PCIe slot with the notch in the card and press it into place, making sure the lock snaps shut. Now at the back of the case, you can lower the cover back down and secure the GPU with one or more of these screws. Now flip the case onto its feet because there's one more thing to plug in. Take the SATA power connector from the case that looks like this and grab one of the SATA power cables from the power supply. Line these up, matching the pattern and pressing them together. With that done, everything is installed, but we have one more thing to do before closing up the system, which is cable management. Basically, just pull any excess cable link to the back of the case and tuck it in/away and try and make it as flat as possible so the back panel can easily be reinstalled. Just make sure the main chamber looks nice and the cables are flat and you're going to be fine. You can now hinge the back panel on like this and resecure the 2 thumb screws. Now with the case on its side, put the glass panel on with the internal side facing up like this so you can remove this plastic. Now flip it into its correct orientation like this and remove this other layer of plastic. You can now reinstall the 4 thumb screws we removed earlier and remove this annoying sticker. It didn't leave a ton of residue, but I wish it was installed above the plastic and not directly on the glass itself. Finally, you can peel off the front plastic and you're ready to boot your system up for the first time. With that being said, there are still two things you need to do before you can start downloading and enjoying games. The first is to install Windows. I'm not going to show you how to do that in this video, but I'll link a good guide down below. It's super simple and you don't even need to have a Windows key to install and use it. Next, you need to install drivers. For the graphics card drivers, head to Nvidia's website linked in the description, select GeForce 900 series and 960. Now just download the latest version, open it up and do the express install. Finally, you need to get the chipset drivers. Head to your motherboard product page, go to support, click chipset, then download and install the latest INF installation for your specific OS. With that done, you're ready to start downloading and enjoying some games. Speaking of games, it's now time to talk about gaming performance and temps. I didn't test a ton of titles, but I tested a good variety that should hopefully give you a decent understanding of the system's overall performance. Starting with Fortnite, I tested this game at 1080p pro settings and hopped into a Team Rumbles match. During the course of the match, I saw a 120 FPS average with 1% lows of 41. This overall was an enjoyable experience. The 1% lows were kind of low compared to the average, but that is to be expected with Fortnite. Next up is Valorant, which I tested at 1080p low settings. In game, I saw an impressive average of 187 with 1% lows of 125. Overall, this was a very good experience and should be good enough for competitive play. Next is a modern AAA title, Borderlands 3. I tested this using the built-in benchmark. To get an average above 60 FPS, I did have to set it to 1080p low, which still looked nice. Doing this resulted in a 63 FPS average with 1% lows of 48. This is great to see. You can play AAA titles like this on the system if you are willing to turn the settings down a bit. Next is Rainbow Six Siege, which I tested at 1080p medium settings using the built-in benchmark. Doing this resulted in a 117 FPS average with 1% lows of 85. Finally, I tested Overwatch at the 1080p high preset it defaulted me to, and doing this resulted in a 95 FPS average with 1% lows of 68. Now, overall, this is pretty good performance, but is a big step down from what it would be if you could have got a GTX 1650 Super or a 5500 XT to pair with this i3. As you can see, it can play most games well, but if you're wanting to play the latest and greatest AAA games, you should probably step up to at least the GTX 970, which will cost you about $50 more than the 960 in this build. In terms of temps, the CPU stayed in the mid 50s most of the time, with very infrequent spikes to the low 60s, which is great, and the GPU stayed in the mid to upper 70s most of the time, with infrequent spikes into the low 80s. The CPU temps are great and the GPU temps are acceptable. If you want lower temps on the GPU, you could install an extra intake fan or replace the thermal paste on the card if it's running unusually hot. All in all, for $500, taking into account the current market, I'm pretty happy with this build and hope you guys enjoyed it or just learned something new. These build guides are a lot of work, but if you keep watching them, I'll keep making them. So yeah guys, I think this wraps this video up. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, make sure to give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing. And as always, this is Matt from Tech by Matt, signing out.